Jonathan Roumie was about to speak 9 words that would shatter Seth MacFarlane's entire worldview forever, but neither of them saw it coming. The creator of Family Guy had just delivered what he believed would be the perfect comedic knockout punch, a joke so ruthlessly crafted that it would destroy the man who dares to play Jesus on television. The studio lights were blazing, 8.2 million viewers were watching live, and Seth was riding high on the laughter of his audience, confident that his razor-sharp wit had finally put this religious actor in his place. But Jonathan's response would do more than shock everyone in that late-night studio. It would expose a secret that Seth MacFarlane had spent 30 years and $500 million trying to bury. What were those 9 words that stopped Hollywood's comedy king cold? What could a humble actor from New York possibly say that would force one of the most powerful men in entertainment to break down on live television? Why did 3 major networks immediately try to scrub this footage from the internet? And what was the devastating personal revelation that Seth had hidden from the world for 3 decades? This is the story of the night when unshakable faith collided with billion-dollar cynicism, and it all began when Seth MacFarlane made the catastrophic mistake of mocking the wrong man's God on the wrong night. The secret Seth had been hiding wasn't just personal, it was the driving force behind every joke he'd ever written, every character he'd created, and every attack he'd launched against faith itself. For 30 years, he had built an empire of laughter on the foundation of his own unhealed wounds, and in 9 simple words, Jonathan Roumie was about to expose the pain that turned America's funniest man into its most wounded soul. But here's what neither of them knew as they sat across from each other that night. Jonathan himself was carrying a burden so heavy that it would change everything about how you see faith, fame, and the price of living authentically in Hollywood. The collision between these 2 men wasn't an accident. It was the culmination of a journey that began 25 years earlier in a small church in Connecticut, involved a tragedy that Seth never spoke about publicly, and led to a moment of grace so profound that it would transform not just their lives, but the lives of millions who witnessed what happened next. What you're about to discover will challenge everything you thought you knew about comedy, faith, and the invisible battles that shape the people we watch on our screens every day. 2 weeks before that fateful night, Jonathan Roumie was kneeling in his small Chicago apartment, praying over a letter that would change everything. The envelope bore the official logo of Seth MacFarlane's production company, and inside was an invitation that made Jonathan's heart race with both excitement and terror. Seth wanted him as a guest on his late-night comedy special, Hollywood After Dark, promising what the letter called a respectful dialogue about faith in entertainment. But Jonathan had done his research, and he knew this was no ordinary invitation. This was a setup, carefully orchestrated by one of the most brilliant comedic minds in Hollywood, designed to publicly humiliate the man who had dared to portray Jesus with genuine reverence. The apartment around Jonathan told the story of a man who had chosen authenticity over fortune. The walls were bare except for a simple wooden cross his grandmother had carved in Lebanon and a faded photograph of his father, who had died believing his son's acting dreams were foolish fantasies. His kitchen table was covered with hundreds of letters from viewers of The Chosen, people writing to thank him for showing them what real faith looked like in a world drowning in spiritual counterfeits. Unlike every other actor in Hollywood, Jonathan had never hired an agent, never moved to a mansion, never traded his principles for prosperity. His bank account rarely held more than $2,000 because he gave away everything beyond his basic needs, living by the same principles as the man he portrayed on screen. But this invitation felt different, charged with a spiritual weight that Jonathan couldn't ignore. As he researched Seth MacFarlane's work, his heart broke for the brilliant man who had weaponized his pain into comedy gold. Family Guy's relentless mockery of Christianity, American Dad's cynical worldview, the Orville's subtle atheistic philosophy, all of it pointed to a wounded soul using laughter as armor against a God he couldn't stop thinking about. Jonathan discovered that Seth's attacks on faith weren't random or casual. They were surgical, precise, and deeply personal, as if every joke was aimed at settling an ancient score with heaven itself. The deeper Jonathan dug, the more he found traces of something Seth had tried to erase from his public story. Birth records showing Seth had been baptized in a small Connecticut church. Elementary school photos from a Christian academy that Seth never mentioned in interviews. And most intriguingly, a newspaper clipping from 1998 that mentioned Seth MacFarlane's name in connection with a tragic event at a youth ministry retreat, an article that had mysteriously vanished from every digital archive Jonathan could find. Someone had spent considerable money and effort to scrub this story from existence, but Jonathan's training in theology had taught him how to research historical documents that powerful people preferred to keep buried. What Jonathan discovered in that faded newspaper would explain everything about the man who had built an empire on rejecting God. But it would also reveal why Jonathan himself had been chosen for this particular battle. Because 25 years ago, Jonathan Roumie had been there too, at that same retreat, witness to the tragedy that had turned Seth MacFarlane from a believing young man into Hollywood's most eloquent atheist. The secret they shared wasn't just about what had happened that night. It was about what Jonathan had failed to do in the moment when Seth needed someone to show him that God's love was stronger than human failure. As Jonathan prepared for what he knew would be the most important conversation of his life, he realized that this wasn't about winning a debate or defending his faith against comedy. This was about redemption, restoration, and the possibility that God could use even a late-night ambush to heal wounds that had been festering for decades. Jonathan made peace with the reality that this appearance might destroy his career, end his role on The Chosen, and leave him unemployed and unknown. But some truths were worth every sacrifice, and some souls were worth every risk. The question wasn't whether he was strong enough to face Seth MacFarlane's comedic genius. The question was whether he was brave enough to face the broken young man Seth had been hiding behind the laughter all these years. When Jonathan arrived at the MacFarlane Studios complex in Burbank the next morning, he was struck by the overwhelming display of creative power and financial success. The lobby walls were lined with golden awards from every major entertainment organization, photographs of Seth with presidents and celebrities, and movie posters from blockbuster projects that had generated over $3 billion in global revenue. Crystal chandeliers hung from 30-foot ceilings, and the marble floors reflected the California sunshine streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the Hollywood Hills. This was the kingdom that Seth MacFarlane had built on the foundation of his comedic genius, and every detail screamed one message: whoever entered this domain was stepping into the territory of one of the most powerful men in entertainment. The green room buzzed with the energy of Hollywood's elite comedy writers, each one competing to pitch the most devastating joke about the religious actor who had dared to accept Seth's invitation. Jonathan could hear them workshopping material through the thin walls, crafting punchlines designed to eviscerate everything he stood for. "Wait until you see what Seth has planned for the Jesus guy," one writer laughed to another. "He's been working on this takedown for months. By the time tonight's over, that actor won't be able to get a commercial audition, let alone continue playing Christ." The cruel anticipation in their voices revealed the true purpose of this invitation, and Jonathan realized he wasn't walking into an interview. He was entering a coliseum where he was intended to be devoured for the entertainment of millions. While comedy writers celebrated their upcoming victory, Jonathan sat quietly in the corner of the green room, reading his worn copy of the Gospel of John. The contrast couldn't have been more stark. Around him, people discussed seven-figure development deals, exclusive streaming contracts, and marketing strategies with the enthusiasm of generals planning a conquest. They networked aggressively, exchanged business cards, and spoke in the language of entertainment industry power. Jonathan wore his father's old blazer, carried nothing but his Bible, and had no business cards to exchange because he had nothing to sell. His presence in this room was as jarring as a homeless man attending a billionaire's gala, and everyone could feel the tension between two completely different approaches to life and success. A production assistant approached Jonathan with a tablet containing detailed talking points and strategic responses designed to help him survive the interview. "Look, I like you," she whispered conspiratorially, "but Seth has destroyed bigger names than yours. He once made a televangelist cry on live television, and that guy had 30 years of experience. Your only chance is to play along with the comedy, laugh at yourself, and try to come across as a good sport who doesn't take religion too seriously." She showed him video clips of previous guests who had tried to maintain serious positions against Seth's comedic attacks, each one looking foolish and defeated by the end of their segments. The audience loves Seth because he's brilliant, but they'll respect you if you can prove you're not a fanatic who can't take a joke. Jonathan politely declined to review the suggested responses, explaining that he wasn't there to play a character or protect his reputation. The assistant looked confused, as if she had never encountered someone who didn't want to strategically manage their public image. "Then what are you here for?" she asked, genuinely puzzled. Jonathan's answer stopped her cold. "I'm here because Seth MacFarlane is the most talented person in this building, and talent that great doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from depth, from pain, from someone who has experienced more of life than most people ever will. I'm not here to defend myself against his comedy. I'm here to honor the man behind the laughter." The assistant stared at him for a long moment, then walked away shaking her head, muttering something about actors who had lost touch with reality. As the other warm-up guests took the stage before him, Jonathan watched from the wings as Seth expertly dismantled a series of public figures who had made the mistake of thinking they could match wits with one of comedy's greatest minds. Each segment was a masterclass in comedic assassination, with Seth using his quick wit, perfect timing, and encyclopedic knowledge to make his guests look foolish while the audience roared with appreciation. But Jonathan noticed something the laughing crowd missed: the emptiness in Seth's eyes during the brief moments between jokes, the way his smile never quite reached his soul, the subtle tension in his shoulders that suggested a man carrying an invisible weight that no amount of success had been able to lift. When his time finally came, Jonathan walked onto that stage carrying nothing but his faith and a secret that could either destroy Seth MacFarlane or set him free. The audience applauded politely, expecting another lamb to be led to slaughter, but they had no idea they were about to witness something unprecedented in late-night television history. As Jonathan took his seat across from Seth, he quietly prayed for wisdom, courage, and the grace to speak truth with love. He looked into the eyes of the man who had spent decades perfecting the art of spiritual mockery and saw not an enemy to be defeated, but a wounded soul who had never learned that God's love was stronger than human failure. What happened next would change both of their lives forever, and shock an audience that thought they were just tuning in for another night of comedy gold. Seth MacFarlane greeted Jonathan with his trademark charming smile, but there was something predatory in his eyes as he sized up the man who had walked willingly into his comedic trap. The audience settled into their seats with the anticipation of lions waiting to be fed, and Seth opened with the smooth confidence that had made him one of the most feared interviewers in late-night television. "Jonathan Roumie, the man who plays Jesus Christ on The Chosen," he began, his voice carrying that perfect blend of warmth and barely concealed mockery that had become his signature. "I have to ask, when you're portraying the Son of God, do you ever worry about getting a bad performance review from upstairs?" The audience erupted in laughter, and Seth's smile widened as he delivered what he thought would be the first of many devastating blows to his guest's composure. But Jonathan's response caught everyone off guard. Instead of laughing nervously or defending himself, he looked directly at Seth with eyes full of genuine compassion and said, "Seth, that's actually a beautiful question, because it shows you understand that if Jesus is real, then authenticity matters more than performance." The laughter died instantly as the audience realized this wasn't going to be the typical comedy roast they had expected. Jonathan continued, "Every day I wake up knowing that if I'm going to represent Christ, I have to live like Christ, which means I have to love people the way he loved them, completely, sacrificially, and without condition." The sincerity in his voice was so profound that even Seth's practiced composure flickered for just a moment. Seth quickly regrouped, his comedic instincts kicking in as he attempted to steer the conversation back into his comfort zone of intellectual skepticism and religious mockery. "Well, that's very noble, Jonathan, but surely you can appreciate the irony of making millions of dollars playing a character who famously said it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter heaven." The joke was perfectly crafted, designed to expose hypocrisy and get the audience laughing at the expense of yet another religious figure who failed to live up to their own standards. Seth leaned back in his chair with the confidence of a master craftsman who had just delivered a killing blow. Jonathan reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded bank statement, just as he had done with Oprah months earlier. "Seth, you're absolutely right to call out hypocrisy wherever you find it," he said calmly. "So let me show you something." He held up the paper toward the camera and the audience. This is my bank statement from last week. My balance is $1,623. I live in the same apartment I've had for 6 years, drive a 12-year-old Honda, and give away everything except what I need to survive. The revelation sent a shock wave through the studio that was so powerful you could feel it in the silence that followed. This wasn't the wealthy Hollywood hypocrite Seth had expected to destroy. The audience was completely silent now, and Seth's confident smile began to crack around the edges. This wasn't going according to script. Jonathan continued, "You see, Seth, when Jesus called people to follow him, he didn't ask them to be perfect. He asked them to be real. And the realest thing I can do is live like I actually believe what I say I believe." The simplicity of the statement was devastating in its authenticity, and Seth found himself in the unfamiliar position of being outmaneuvered not by superior wit, but by superior character. But Seth MacFarlane hadn't built an entertainment empire by backing down from a challenge. He leaned forward with renewed intensity, his voice taking on the sharp edge that signaled he was moving from comedy into something more personal and dangerous. "That's very admirable, Jonathan, but let's talk about the elephant in the room. You're asking people to believe in talking snakes, parting seas, and dead people coming back to life. In an age of science and reason, isn't it a little insulting to people's intelligence to peddle these ancient fairy tales as literal truth?" The attack was more sophisticated now, appealing to the audience's sense of intellectual superiority and positioning Jonathan as a naive fundamentalist who threatened the progress of human enlightenment. Jonathan paused, and in that moment of silence, something extraordinary happened. Instead of rising to defend himself against the intellectual attack, he looked at Seth with the kind of understanding that comes from knowing someone's deepest wounds. "Seth," he said quietly, "you're one of the most brilliant men I've ever had the privilege to meet. Your shows demonstrate an understanding of human nature, storytelling, and emotional truth that most people never achieve. Someone with your intelligence doesn't spend decades attacking something unless it once meant everything to them." The words hit the studio like a physical force, and suddenly the power dynamic shifted completely. The audience leaned forward as they sensed something unprecedented happening. This wasn't comedy anymore, this was surgery, and Jonathan was operating on Seth's soul with the precision of someone who understood exactly where the wounds were hidden. Seth's face went pale as he realized that Jonathan knew something, that this humble actor had somehow discovered the secret Seth had spent 30 years and millions of dollars trying to bury. The hunter had become the hunted, and the man who had destroyed countless opponents with his wit was about to face something far more dangerous than he had ever encountered. Someone who knew the truth about his past and loved him anyway. "What are you talking about?" Seth asked, but his voice had lost its confident edge. For the first time in his career, Seth MacFarlane looked vulnerable on his own show, and Jonathan's response would either destroy him or set him free. The audience held its breath as they realized they were witnessing something that would change late-night television forever. The comedy king was about to meet his match, not in another comedian, but in a man who had learned to fight with weapons Seth had forgotten existed: truth, love, and the power of grace to heal even the deepest wounds. Jonathan looked at Seth with the gentleness of someone about to perform heart surgery on a friend. "Seth, do you remember Camp Galilee? Summer of 1998? You were 19 years old, full of faith, leading worship songs around a campfire." The color drained completely from Seth's face, and his hands began to tremble. The confident entertainer was gone, replaced by a 19-year-old boy whose world had been shattered in a single night. "How do you know about that?" Seth whispered, his voice cracking. Jonathan's response hit like a bomb. "Because I was there, Seth. I was the 17-year-old kid sitting across the fire from you when you led us in Amazing Grace, just hours before everything changed." The studio fell into deafening silence as Seth's carefully maintained public persona crumbled in real time. "You were the most passionate believer I had ever met," Jonathan continued, his voice filled with grief. "You talked about using your creativity to serve God, about being like C.S. Lewis. Then the accident happened." Those 4 words hit the studio like lightning. Tommy Richardson, 8 years old, the pastor's son. You were watching the kids during free swim, but that little girl Sarah needed counseling. You didn't see Tommy slip into the deep end until it was almost too late. Seth buried his face in his hands as the memory came flooding back. 4 minutes underwater, Seth. Brain damage, severe and permanent. The audience watched the most powerful man in comedy reduced to a broken child. His parents forgave you immediately, but you couldn't forgive yourself. You couldn't understand how a loving God would let an innocent child suffer because of your mistake. For the first time since the accident, Seth spoke his buried truth. I decided that either God didn't exist, or he was too cruel to deserve my worship. I figured if I could make people laugh about religion, maybe I could save them from that kind of pain. His voice was raw and broken as the audience witnessed the real birth of Family Guy's creator. Jonathan nodded with understanding. So you spent 30 years building an empire to protect people from God by convincing them he was fictional or ridiculous. Every joke became a shield, every cartoon a wall between you and the faith that once meant everything to you. The psychological surgery was almost complete, but Jonathan wasn't finished. But here's what you never knew, Seth. The words hit like lightning. Tommy Richardson didn't stay brain damaged. Seth's head snapped up with desperate hope. Complete recovery within 6 months. The doctors called it miraculous. He became a pediatric neurosurgeon who has saved hundreds of children's lives. He credits that day at camp as the moment God called him to heal kids. Seth stared in complete shock, his worldview crashing down like a house of cards. That's impossible. I would have known. Jonathan showed him a recent news article about Dr. Thomas Richardson receiving a humanitarian award. Tommy tried to reach you for years. He wanted to thank you, to let you know that your worst day was actually the beginning of his calling to save children. He never stopped praying for you, Seth. The revelation hit like a spiritual atomic bomb. Everything Seth had built, every joke, every attack on faith, all based on a tragedy that had actually become a triumph he never knew about. The comedy king was about to face the most important choice of his life, and his next words would determine whether 30 years of pain would finally be transformed into purpose. Seth sat frozen in his chair, staring at the photo of Dr. Tommy Richardson on Jonathan's phone, his entire reality collapsing around him. 30 years of atheism, billions in comedy empire revenue, millions of fans who followed his anti-faith worldview, all built on a lie he had told himself about God's cruelty. The audience held its breath as they watched the most confident man in Hollywood reduced to trembling silence by a truth he never knew existed. I don't understand, Seth whispered, his voice barely audible. If Tommy recovered, if God was working miracles, then why didn't anyone tell me? Why did I spend 3 decades thinking I had ruined that little boy's life? The pain in his voice was so raw that several audience members began crying, witnessing the birth of genuine vulnerability from someone they had only known as untouchable success. Jonathan leaned forward with infinite compassion. Seth, there's something else you need to know. Something that will explain everything. He paused, and the studio fell into the kind of silence that only comes before life-changing revelations. Tommy didn't just recover and become a doctor. 3 months ago, he called the Chosen production office. He had seen you announce this interview, and he wanted to be here tonight. Seth's eyes widened in terror and hope as Jonathan continued. He's been sitting in the green room for the past hour, waiting for permission to see you. Waiting to deliver a message he's carried in his heart for 25 years. The revelation hit the audience like an earthquake, and cameras captured every micro-expression on Seth's face as he grappled with the impossible reality that the child whose life he thought he had destroyed was just rooms away. He's here, Seth asked, his voice cracking with emotion. Right now? Jonathan nodded, and suddenly Seth was 19 years old again, drowning in guilt and desperate for redemption he never believed would come. What does he want to say to me? The question hung in the air like a prayer, and Jonathan's response would either complete Seth's destruction or begin his resurrection. Jonathan stood up slowly and walked toward the green room entrance. Seth MacFarlane, he called out, there's someone here who has a message for you. The studio doors opened, and a tall man in a doctor's coat walked onto the stage. The audience gasped audibly as they realized they were witnessing the reunion between the guilt-ridden comedian and the child whose near drowning had changed both their lives forever. Dr. Tommy Richardson looked exactly like the 8-year-old boy Seth remembered, except now he carried himself with the confident compassion of someone who had spent his life saving children. He walked directly to Seth, who was now sobbing uncontrollably, and knelt down beside his chair. The audience watched in stunned silence as the man Seth thought he had destroyed prepared to speak the words that would change everything. "Seth," Tommy said gently, his voice filled with warmth and gratitude. "I need you to know something that I've been trying to tell you for 25 years. He paused, looking into the eyes of the man who had haunted himself with unnecessary guilt. "That day at the lake wasn't your fault. It was God's plan." Seth looked up through his tears, barely able to process what he was hearing. Tommy continued, "Every child I've saved in surgery, every life I've been able to heal, every family that still has their son or daughter because of the skills God gave me, it all started in that moment when you pulled me from the water. You didn't ruin my life, Seth. You saved it, and then God used what happened to give me a purpose bigger than I ever could have imagined." The words hung in the air like angels singing, and Seth stared at Tommy with the wonder of someone witnessing a resurrection. But Tommy wasn't finished. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a worn piece of paper, a child's drawing of a man pulling a boy from water, with the words, "My hero Seth," written in crayon across the top. "I drew this in the hospital while I was recovering," Tommy said, showing the picture to Seth and the cameras. "I kept it all these years because I wanted you to know that you weren't the villain in my story. You were the hero. And every time I save a child's life, I remember the man who saved mine first." Seth took the drawing with shaking hands, and as he looked at the innocent artwork, 30 years of self-imposed exile from God crumbled away like chains falling from a prisoner's wrists. Tommy placed his hand on Seth's shoulder and delivered the 9 words that would change everything. "God never stopped loving you through my healing hands." The simple sentence hit Seth with the force of divine lightning, and he collapsed into Tommy's arms, sobbing with the relief of a man who had finally come home after decades of wandering in spiritual wilderness. The audience watched in awe as comedy and tragedy, guilt and grace, human failure and divine redemption collided in perfect harmony on live television. Seth MacFarlane clung to Tommy Richardson like a drowning man grabbing a lifeline, his body shaking with 30 years of released pain. The man who had built an empire on mocking God was experiencing the very grace he had spent decades denying existed. Through his tears, he whispered words that shocked everyone in that studio. "I'm so sorry, Tommy. I'm so sorry I ran from God instead of running to him." Tommy held him tighter, speaking with the authority of someone who had experienced divine healing firsthand. "Seth, God used your guilt to drive you to greatness, and now he wants to use your greatness for his glory. Every joke you've written, every story you've told, every talent you've developed, none of it was wasted. It was all preparation for this moment when you would finally understand that God's plan was bigger than your mistakes." The audience watched in stunned silence as Seth slowly lifted his head, his face transformed by something they had never seen before, genuine peace. The hardness around his eyes was gone, replaced by the wonder of a child discovering that the monster he had been hiding from was actually a loving father who had been waiting patiently for his return. "What do I do now?" Seth asked, his voice small and uncertain. "How do I fix 30 years of running in the wrong direction?" Jonathan knelt down beside both men, creating a circle of grace that encompassed decades of pain and healing. "Seth, the beautiful thing about God is that he doesn't waste anything. Not your talent, not your influence, not even your rebellion. He's been using it all to prepare you for something greater than anything you've ever imagined." He paused, looking directly into Seth's eyes. The same creativity that built Family Guy can build something that points people toward hope instead of away from it. Tommy pulled out his phone and showed Seth something that made his eyes widen in amazement. "Seth, look at this." On the screen was a video message from a young patient in Tommy's hospital, a 10-year-old girl with terminal cancer who had been watching this interview live from her hospital bed. "Dr. Tommy told me that the funny man on TV just found out that God loves him," the little girl said with a radiant smile. "Can you tell him that I'm praying for him? And maybe he can make funny shows that help other kids know God loves them too." The innocent request hit Seth like a revelation from heaven itself. Here was a dying child asking him to use his gifts not to mock faith, but to make it accessible and joyful for others. "She doesn't even know me," Seth whispered, "but she's praying for me?" Tommy nodded, smiling through his own tears. "That's what grace looks like, Seth. Undeserved love from people who see you the way God sees you, not as you were, but as you're becoming." Seth stood up slowly, his legs unsteady but his voice growing stronger with each word. He turned to the cameras and spoke directly to the millions watching. "I don't know how to do this," he said honestly. "I don't know how to be the man I was supposed to be before fear and guilt twisted me into someone else. But I know I can't keep building walls between people and God when He's been trying to love them through me all along." The transformation was visible, measurable, undeniable. The man who had entered that studio as Hollywood's most eloquent atheist was leaving as a prodigal son coming home to a father who had never stopped waiting. Tommy handed Seth his business card with his personal phone number written on the back. "Call me anytime," he said. "I've been praying for this moment for 25 years, and I'm not going anywhere now." As the interview came to an end, Seth did something unprecedented in late-night television history. Instead of ending with comedy, music, or celebrity promotion, he asked the audience to join him in a moment of silence for everyone who had ever felt too broken, too guilty, or too far gone to believe in second chances. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of the presence of grace, healing, and the possibility of redemption for anyone brave enough to face their deepest wounds. When Seth finally looked up from that moment of silence, his eyes held something they hadn't contained in 30 years: hope. Not the manufactured optimism of entertainment, but the genuine hope that comes from knowing you're loved despite your worst failures, and that your greatest mistakes can become the foundation for your most meaningful purpose. 6 months after that miraculous night, a quiet news story appeared that most mainstream media ignored, but that brought tears to Jonathan's eyes when he read it. Seth MacFarlane had quietly donated $50 million to build a new children's wing at Tommy Richardson's hospital, with one condition: that it be named not after Seth, but after the little girl with terminal cancer who had prayed for him during the interview. The wing opened with a simple plaque that read, "Sarah's Hope Wing, where healing meets laughter." The transformation in Seth's work was immediate and profound. His next animated series, Grace Street, told the story of flawed people discovering unconditional love, and it became the most watched family show in television history. Instead of mocking faith, Seth began weaving themes of redemption, forgiveness, and second chances into storylines that made audiences laugh and cry simultaneously. Critics who expected him to fail were shocked when the show garnered both massive ratings and critical acclaim, proving that hope sells better than cynicism. But the most beautiful change happened away from the cameras entirely. Every Thursday evening, Seth could be found in Tommy's hospital, not signing autographs or posing for photos, but sitting quietly with sick children, reading them stories and sharing the hope he had rediscovered. The same creativity that once tore down faith now built it up, one bedside conversation at a time. Tommy often watched from the doorway as Seth helped kids process their fears through humor and truth, and he knew that his childhood accident had indeed been part of God's perfect plan. The interview itself became the most watched late-night segment in television history, with over 800 million views across all platforms. But more importantly, it became a catalyst for thousands of people to share their own stories of healing and redemption. Comments poured in from viewers around the world who said that watching Seth's transformation gave them permission to face their own buried guilt and pain. The most powerful testimony came from a former pastor who wrote, "I watched the most cynical man in Hollywood find his way back to God. If Seth MacFarlane can come home, maybe there's hope for all of us." Jonathan and Seth became unlikely friends, meeting regularly to discuss faith, creativity, and the responsibility that comes with influence. Their conversations often centered around Tommy, who had become like a younger brother to both men. The three of them formed a bond that transcended their different backgrounds and careers, united by the understanding that God can use even our deepest wounds to create something beautiful. Today, Seth MacFarlane is still one of the most powerful men in entertainment, but his power now serves a different purpose. His shows consistently rank among the most positive influences on television, and his personal testimony has inspired countless others to believe that it's never too late to change direction. When asked about his dramatic transformation, he simply says, "I spent 30 years running from love and discovered that love had been chasing me the whole time." The story of that night continues to ripple outward, changing lives in ways that no amount of money or fame ever could. It serves as proof that the most profound transformations happen not when we finally get all the answers, but when we finally get the courage to face the questions we've been avoiding. Sometimes the very thing we think disqualifies us from God's love is exactly what qualifies us to understand His grace. If this story moved something in your heart, then perhaps it's time to stop running from the love that's been chasing you your whole life. Hit that subscribe button and share this story with someone who needs to know that second chances aren't just possible, they're promised. And tell us in the comments, what would you say to someone who's been carrying guilt for 30 years? Because somewhere out there, someone needs to hear that their worst mistake might actually be the beginning of their greatest purpose.